Firstly, with a new Supreme Court ruling on Article 50, is there any chance that MPs could actually block Brexit from happening?
Well, I welcome the court ruling on Article 50, the fact that Parliament now will have a say on the triggering of that article. And the reasons it's important is not because we're trying to override the result of June the 23rd. It's clear that the referendum voted in favour of leaving the EU, and that's not in question. What is in question is where we're going as a result of that decision. In other words, we've had a decision to leave the EU. We've not really had a decision as to where we're actually going, because Brexit has lots of different guises. It can look like a so-called soft Brexit, where we are still essentially members of the single market, where we still have all of the social and environmental protections. So that would be along the so-called Norway model, right through to the WTO model, the World Trade Organization model, where we're outside the single market completely. Now, those options have very big implications for our economy, for our future, for our prosperity. And I think it is right that the government has to put in the public domain in front of MPs which kind of Brexit they're going for, so that we can discuss and debate that.
So do you expect this to delay the triggering of Article 50?
I don't think there's any reason why the court ruling should delay the triggering of Article 50. We've said that the government said that that's going to happen at the end of March. Once it does happen, of course, it starts a clock ticking for 2 years, and the negotiations have to be finished by the end of that 2-year period. So it'll be important that there is real clarity at the time of the Parliament's vote. But I don't see any particular reason why this should delay that triggering. And as I say, I think it's a positive way forward.
So what conditions do you sort of hope will be met before Article 50 is triggered?
Well, I would like the Parliament to be able to see what kind of Brexit the government is aiming for. I mean, obviously, it's not about the final deal, because that's up to the negotiation with 27 other countries. But I think it would be helpful to know, is the government envisaging that the UK would still remain part of the single market? And that's important for business, because it means that there are not the extra tariffs and non-tariff barriers. In other words, that is a better way really for business to be. That would also have the advantage of the strong environmental safeguards, because if you're part of the single market, then all of that environmental legislation that goes with that is left intact. Similarly with workers' rights. Now, the Green Party has been very upfront about our position. We, first of all, would like to have remained in the EU. We weren't successful with that, but I think we would want a situation where we remain as close to the EU as possible. And so from our perspective, that so-called softer Brexit would be the one that we would be hoping that Mrs May will bring forward.
And what are you doing to lobby Parliament to sort of work towards a softer Brexit?
I think one of the things that MPs can do is to try to get to the bottom of what different sectors will look like if Brexit happens. And so, for example, as a member of the Environmental Audit Committee in Parliament, we've been having an inquiry into the environmental impacts of Brexit. And so what happens to things like the Bathing Water Directive, which here in Brighton has been so important in terms of guaranteeing clean beaches and clean seas. What will happen to all of the legislation around, household appliances and energy efficiency standards and our Paris climate change commitments and so on. There are huge implications for all sectors really of society and of the economy as a result of proposed Brexit. So that means that having a better understanding of what those impacts are will give us greater ammunition, if you like, to be able to urge the government to make sure that vital safeguards are kept.
And now, what can sort of people or citizens do to help steer the government in the direction they want it to go? How can they get involved?
In terms of citizens getting involved in the process, I think it is important that as a result of the decision that Article 50 will come to Parliament, Parliament will have the right to vote on that triggering of Article 50. That means there's all the more reason for citizens to be contacting their MPs, lobbying their MPs, writing to them, meeting them, and talking to them about what kind of Brexit they want to see. Because I think it's too easy for the government simply to say that it knows that there's an overwhelming case against immigration, for example. I mean, that's what they will often say. And yet when you actually talk to people who voted to leave, there are a whole set of reasons people might have wished to do that. And a lot of it was to do with the feeling that they've been left behind by successive governments, that their concerns haven't been listened to by successive governments. And so, understanding people's concerns about housing or the NHS or education and so forth, I think is going to be crucial. So having those conversations with your MPs, making sure your MPs know what you think, is going to be really important.
All right, and how is the government working to hold the Leave campaign to sort of account on their promises, let's say about the NHS? That was a big part of the Leave campaign slogan, was more money for the NHS, and they've retracted that now. So what are the chances of people actually seeing some of the changes that they were hoping to see that were promised by the Leave campaign, sort of regarding the NHS and immigration?
Of course, the Leave campaign made a whole raft of very dubious promises during the referendum campaign, and the biggest lie of all, of course, was the famous bus with the £350 million a week emblazoned on it for the NHS, this idea that we would have that extra money then to go to the NHS. It's been interesting how the government has said next to nothing about that ever since, and of course one of the reasons for that is that quite a few of the key Leave campaigners are now in prominent positions in the government. But I think it does matter, and I think it's significant that quite often at Prime Minister's questions and so forth, people from the opposition benches are regularly asking, if their hospital could be first in line, please, for this week's 350 million cash boost. And I would certainly like to have that cash boost here for the Royal Sussex Hospital here in Brighton. So I think we can keep the pressure up, but sadly, because so many of the prominent Leave campaigners are now in government, I think we're not going to see the delivery of those promises.
All right, and now two questions. One, what is your greatest fear about Brexit, your greatest worry about the direction it will take the country, and what is your greatest hope sort of for change, for positive change?
I guess my greatest fear about Brexit is that I think there's going to be an awful lot of people around the country who are going to be feeling very disappointed that so many of the things that they were promised during the Leave campaign simply aren't going to happen. And we already know, for example, that 350 million a week is not going to go to the NHS. I think it's fairly clear that the economy is not going to be better off, and we've seen already the way in which the pound has plummeted and the way in which the economy is already looking rockier, and the forecasts are getting dimmer, and the amount of money in people's purses is going to be less. And so I worry about the backlash when people realise just the extent to which they have been deceived, frankly. I worry that we're going to end up with a mess of a Brexit, because the government doesn't seem to know what it really wants, and that could mean, if we're not careful, that we will just end up by having the so-called WTO option by default. In other words, the option that has least connection to the EU, least help for our economy, least protection for social and environmental rights. The Green Party stands up for freedom of movement. We want to celebrate that. We want to say that people from other EU countries who are here now are welcome, and their future shouldn't be used as pawns, really, in a kind of game that the government's playing with other EU member states as to whether or not those nationals can stay. Of course they should be able to stay. So I worry that we're going to a kind of a dimmer, grimmer, more costly future. In terms of any hopes in all of this, well, I suppose there are two. On the sectoral issues, if we're actually looking at something like agriculture, then it's clear that one thing that the EU was not very good at was the common agricultural policy. And if in the ongoing negotiations post-referendum we might have a chance of designing a better agricultural system that will be good for our farmers but also good for our environment, that could be a positive. And overall, I hope that one of the conclusions that will be drawn from this whole process is that in order to heal the country, I think that we need to look again at our electoral system, because I think one of the reasons so many people voted Leave is because they felt that their views haven't been listened to for successive generations. One of the reasons they think that is because essentially we have a voting system that means that the big parties care only about the marginal voters in the swing seats. And so all of those people that have lived in so-called safe seats where the same MP gets back time after time means that their views simply aren't taken seriously. I think the referendum showed that people want to have a say, they want their voices heard. And one way to do that would be to change that electoral system so that people's voices are heard every year at every election, not just when they're granted a referendum.